The first time I saw Eunice Okonkwo, she was hunched in the corner of the interview room at the Federal Custodial Center. Her thin frame seemed to fold in on itself as if trying to disappear. Only 18 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the darkest corners of humanity. I am Barrister Emmanuel Adeyemi. For 15 years, I have represented the forgotten faces of our justice system, but Eunice's case would come to haunt me in ways I could never have anticipated. The custodial center's interview room, with its peeling paint and single flickering fluorescent light, had become a second home to me over the years. But that day in late August 2023, as I set my worn leather briefcase on the metal table and pulled out my notepad, I had no idea that the soft-spoken girl across from me would change the course of my career. "My name is Eunice," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not do what they say I did." It's a claim I've heard countless times, but something in her eyes, a raw, wounded honesty, made me believe her claim. This is her story, a story of poverty, injustice, and a system designed to break those who cannot afford to defend themselves. Eunice was born in a small village on the outskirts of our city. Her earliest memory was of her father's funeral when she was just 5 years old. "Everyone was crying," she told me, but I kept waiting for him to come back. I didn't understand what death meant. Her mother, overwhelmed with grief and the burden of providing for 3 children alone, fell ill shortly after. By the time Eunice turned 7, both her parents were gone, leaving her and her siblings to be split among relatives. Eunice was sent to live with her maternal grandmother, a woman already in her 70s, who sold vegetables at a local market. "School was my favorite place," Eunice revealed during our third meeting, a shy smile briefly illuminating her face. "I was good at mathematics. My teacher said I could become an engineer someday." But dreams cost money in our country. By the time she reached 12, it became clear that her grandmother could no longer afford the school fees. The old woman's eyesight was failing, making her work at the market increasingly difficult. "I told Grandma it was okay," Eunice recalled. "I said I would help instead." And so, at an age when most children worry about homework and friendships, Eunice began selling agidi, a traditional corn pudding, on the streets. Every morning she would rise before dawn to help her grandmother prepare the food, then spend hours walking through neighborhoods, calling out her wares. "On good days, I made enough for our food, and maybe a little extra," she told me. "On bad days, we went hungry." Despite the hardship, there was dignity in their life. Eunice spoke of her grandmother with reverence, how the old woman insisted on praying before each meal, no matter how meager, and how she taught Eunice to hold her head high, even when customers treated her poorly. "Grandma always said, 'Your poverty is not your shame. It is the shame of a world that allows a child to go hungry.'" The events that led to Eunice's arrest began innocuously enough. On August 12, 2023, she had finished her rounds earlier than usual. The heat that day was oppressive, driving potential customers indoors, and she had sold barely half her agidi. Walking home, she passed by Musa's shop, a small convenience store where she occasionally purchased sugar or salt for her grandmother when they could afford it. The owner, Mr. Musa, was kind to her, sometimes giving her past date biscuits that he couldn't sell. That day, she noticed a group of men standing outside the shop. One of them, later identified as Kabiru Sani, a man in his late 40s, called her over. He asked if I wanted to earn some extra money. Eunice explained, her voice dropping even lower. He said he needed someone small who could help retrieve something from behind Mr. Musa's counter while he distracted him. Eunice hesitated. It felt wrong, but he said it was just a package that belonged to him that Mr. Musa was holding for him but being difficult about returning. Hungry and worried about returning home with unsold agidi, Eunice agreed. It was a decision that would alter the course of her life. What Eunice didn't know was that Kabiru and his 2 companions, James Okafor and Daniel Emmanuel, had been under police surveillance for weeks, suspected of involvement in a string of armed robberies. As Eunice entered the shop, plainclothes officers were already moving in. According to the police report I later obtained, What happened next was a coordinated apprehension of armed robbery suspects. But Eunice's account painted a very different picture. I had just stepped into the shop when there was shouting, she recalled, trembling as she spoke. Someone grabbed me from behind. I dropped my tray with the remaining agidi. I was pushed to the ground, my face against the floor. Someone put their knee on my back. By the time the dust settled, Eunice and the three men had been bundled into police vehicles. Mr. Musa, confused and frightened by the sudden commotion in his shop, could offer little clarification. Yes, Kabiru was a regular customer. No, he had never noticed anything suspicious. And the girl, he recognized her as one of the local hawkers, nothing more. But in the narrative already being constructed at the police station, Eunice had been transformed from an unwitting pawn to a full accomplice, the small one of the gang, used to access tight spaces and scout locations due to her unassuming appearance as a hawker. What followed was 7 days of what can only be described as torture. Eunice was held at the Central Police Station, separated from the male suspects but subjected to interrogation techniques that violated every human rights convention our country has signed. I have represented many clients who claimed mistreatment in police custody. But as Eunice slowly revealed the details of our ordeal, often stopping mid-sentence, overcome by the memory, I found myself having to leave the interview room several times to compose myself. The first day, they just shouted questions at me, she said. Where were the guns hidden? Who was the leader? How many robberies had I participated in? I kept telling them I didn't know anything about any robberies, that I was just selling my agidi. By the second day, the questioning had escalated. Eunice was denied food and water. She was not allowed to sleep, kept awake by officers who would splash water on her whenever she dozed off. I asked to call my grandmother, she told me, wiping away silent tears. I begged them. She would be worried sick about me. They laughed and said criminals don't get phone calls. On the third day, according to Eunice, a new officer took over her interrogation, a man she described as having dead eyes. What happened next still disturbs me deeply as I recall her account. They hung me upside down from something on the ceiling, she whispered, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, seeing not the interview room but that place of torment. My hands were tied behind my back. The blood rushed to my head until I thought it would explode. They kept her suspended until she lost consciousness. When she came to, the questioning began again. Where were the guns? Who else was involved? How long had she been working with the gang? Day 4 brought escalated horrors. They used cigarettes, she said simply, unable to elaborate further. It was only in our later sessions that she revealed they had burned her thighs and, most horrifically, her genitals with cigarettes and lighters. By day 5, Eunice was in a state of delirium from pain, dehydration, and sleep deprivation. The officers brought her a document, a confession stating that she had served as a lookout for an armed robbery gang for the past 6 months, that she had handled weapons, and that she had received a share of the stolen money. I couldn't even read it, she told me. My eyes wouldn't focus, but they put a pen in my hand and moved it for me to sign. Still, she resisted. Day 6 brought the breaking point. One of the male suspects, Daniel Emmanuel, was being interrogated in an adjacent room. I could hear him screaming, Eunice recalled, her body shaking at the memory. Then suddenly, the screaming stopped. There was silence, then shouting from the officers. Later, she overheard officers discussing that Daniel had given them trouble and couldn't take it. It was only after my own investigation that I confirmed Daniel Emmanuel had died in police custody. His death hastily attributed to natural causes, despite the extensive bruising and injuries documented by the medical examiner who was eventually allowed to examine the body. On day 7, broken in body and spirit, Eunice signed the confession. I just wanted it to stop, she told me, her voice hollow. I would have confessed to killing the president if they had asked me to. After she signed, an officer informed her that she could be released on bail for 450,000 naira, an impossible sum for someone who lived day to day on the sale of agidi. When she explained she couldn't possibly raise such an amount, the officer merely shrugged. "Then I guess you're staying with us for a long time," he said. As a barrister who has worked within our justice system for 15 years, I am no stranger to its failings. But Eunice's case exposed the rot at its core in ways that shook even my weathered perspective. The police had prevented Eunice from contacting her grandmother or anyone else who might help her when I finally managed to locate the elderly woman. Living in despair, believing her granddaughter had either abandoned her or met with harm on the streets, she broke down in tears. "My Eunice would never steal," she insisted, her aged hands clutching mine. "She is a good girl. She works hard. Someone has made a terrible mistake." But in our system, mistakes are rarely acknowledged, much less corrected. By the time I took on Eunice's case, she had already been transferred to the Federal Custodial Center awaiting trial. The confession, obtained through torture and duress, was the primary evidence against her, along with the testimony of the arresting officers who claimed she had been caught in the act of robbery. The court assigned to her case had a backlog of over 700 cases. At the current rate of proceedings, Eunice might wait 2 to 3 years before her case even reached a preliminary hearing. Meanwhile, the 2 surviving men arrested with her, Kabiru Sani and James Okafor, had somehow managed to secure bail within weeks of their arrest. I later discovered that Kabiru had connections to a local politician who had intervened on his behalf. James had family who sold land to raise his bail money. But Eunice? She had no one but an elderly grandmother who could barely feed herself without her granddaughter's support. "The worst part," Eunice confided during one of our later meetings, "is that I don't know if grandma is okay. Who is taking care of her? Is she eating? Her medicine for her blood pressure, she needs it every day." Taking on Eunice's case has not been without challenges. The police officers involved have closed ranks, denying any mistreatment. Medical examination of Eunice, which I had to petition the court to allow, confirmed extensive injuries consistent with her account of torture, including cigarette burns and injuries to her shoulders and wrists consistent with suspension. But the system moves slowly, deliberately so, I sometimes believe, to wear down those without the resources to endure. I have filed motions to have her confession thrown out as evidence, given the circumstances under which it was obtained. I have petitioned for her release on personal recognizance, given her lack of criminal history and strong community ties. I have submitted formal complaints against the officers involved in her interrogation. Each filing disappears into the bureaucratic abyss of our courts, emerging months later with requests for clarification or additional documentation, or simply denied without explanation. Meanwhile, Eunice remains behind bars. The bright, mathematically gifted girl who once dreamed of becoming an engineer now spends her days in a cell with 5 other women, all similarly caught in the purgatory of pretrial detention. During my most recent visit, I noticed something had changed in Eunice. The terror that had initially paralyzed her had given way to a quiet, simmering anger. When I shared the latest delay in her case, the judge's absence leading to yet another postponement, she didn't cry as she once would have. Instead, she looked at me directly, her gaze unwavering. "If I ever get out of here," she said, "I want to study law. I want to be like you. I want to help people who have no one to speak for them." Her words both inspired and devastated me, because the hard truth is that our system is not designed for the Eunices of this world. It is designed to protect those with money, power, and connections, the very things Eunice lacks. As I write this account, seated in my modest office with Eunice's file open before me, I am struck by the question that has haunted me throughout this case. How many others like her are there? How many innocent people are languishing in our custodial centers and prisons simply because they lacked the resources to defend themselves? How many have signed confessions under torture? How many have given up hope? Eunice's story is not just unique. That is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of her case. She represents thousands of voiceless, powerless individuals, chewed up by a system ostensibly designed to protect them. The reality is that justice in our country, perhaps in most countries, follows the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is to process the poor and powerless through the system with minimal scrutiny or effort. A teenager selling corn pudding on the streets simply doesn't have the political or economic capital to command attention from an overworked, underpaid, and often corrupt judicial system. But I refuse to accept this as immutable fact. Eunice's case has become more than just another file on my desk. It has become a mission, a testament to what happens when we turn a blind eye to systematic injustice. I continue to fight for her release, to have her case properly heard, to expose the brutality she endured at the hands of those sworn to protect citizens. It is an uphill battle, but one I am committed to seeing through to its end. Because if not Eunice, then who? If not now, then when? The grandmother, now being supported by community members I helped organize after learning of her situation, still prepares agidi every morning. For when Eunice comes home, she says, her faith unshaken despite the months of separation. And Eunice herself? She has begun teaching basic literacy to her cellmates, sharing the education she received before poverty cut her schooling short. Even in the darkest of circumstances, her spirit remains unbroken. As a barrister, I am trained to work within the system, but cases like Eunice's force me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the system itself is the problem, and when the system fails those it's meant to protect, it falls to individuals to stand in the gap. For Eunice, I am that gap stander. For countless others like her, who stands? This is the question that should haunt us all. Yesterday, I received word that Eunice's case has been scheduled for a preliminary hearing 6 months from now, a relative victory in a system where cases can languish for years without attention. I brought her the news personally, watching as she absorbed this small spark of hope. 6 months, she repeated, calculating something in her head. I will be 20 by then. The simple statement, a reminder that youth and potential are being squandered behind these walls, struck me with particular force. As I gathered my papers to leave, Eunice reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, the first time she had initiated contact in all our meetings. Thank you, she said, for believing me. In a just world, belief would not be a luxury. Truth would speak for itself, loud and clear. But we do not live in that world. We live in one where the word of a poor teenage girl counts for nothing against the machinery of power. So I continue to fight, not just as Eunice's legal representative, but as the voice she was denied. And I write this account in the hope that her story, one among thousands, might pierce the consciousness of those with the power to effect change. Because Eunice Okonkwo matters, her life matters, her truth matters, and a system that discards her so easily is not worthy of being called justice.